Steve Harvey embarrassed a racist player who mocked a disabled black man, and what led to that moment is a story that will shake you to your core. This wasn't just a casual insult that got brushed aside. This was calculated cruelty, public humiliation, and a disabled man standing alone in a room full of people who did nothing. But then Steve Harvey stepped in. What happened next would strip away the player's arrogance, expose his cruelty, and force him to face the full weight of his actions in a way that would haunt him forever. The air in the room felt different that day, not because anything seemed particularly wrong, but because no one knew what was about to happen. It was the kind of ordinary moment that would later be remembered as extraordinary, the kind of turning point that separates a before and an after in someone's life. Marcus arrived with the same quiet dignity he carried everywhere. Despite the challenges his body presented him, he moved through the space with purpose, with respect, with the kind of presence that comes from someone who refuses to be diminished by circumstance. He had spent years learning how to navigate a world that wasn't built for him. Every ramp, every stair, every sidewalk was a negotiation. Every room he entered came with unspoken questions about whether he belonged there. But Marcus had developed a kind of strength that goes beyond physical capability, strength of someone who chooses to show up anyway, who refuses to hide, who insists on living fully despite the obstacles placed in his path. He had no idea his entire world was about to shift in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The racist player walked in like he owned the place. The kind of guy whose confidence borders on delusion, the type who believes the world exists for his entertainment and everyone else exists to play a supporting role in his narrative. His eyes scanned the room like a predator surveying territory, looking for an audience, looking for someone to dominate, looking for a moment to assert his superiority over someone he could easily diminish. And then he saw Marcus. His expression changed. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, not recognition of Marcus as a person, but recognition of an opportunity. He saw what he thought was weakness. He saw what he believed was an easy target. He saw disability and race as weapons he could use to elevate himself by tearing someone else down. In that single moment, the racist player made a choice that would define not just the next few minutes, but the entire trajectory of what was about to unfold. What the racist player didn't realize was that Marcus wasn't there to be anyone's target. He wasn't there to serve as a punchline or a stepping stone for someone else's ego. Marcus was there because he belonged there. He had every right to be in that space. He had earned his place through his own merits, through his own capabilities, through his own worth as a human being. But none of that mattered to someone like him, someone so consumed with his own ego that he saw disability as weakness, saw race as a weapon to wield, saw another person's vulnerability as an opportunity to climb higher and feel more powerful. The moment came without warning, without any indication of what was about to happen. The mockery started small, almost imperceptibly, a smirk that lingered just a fraction too long, a gesture that was just slightly exaggerated, words designed to sting, crafted specifically to humiliate, wrapped in a tone that dared anyone to call him out on them. The racist player was testing the waters, seeing how far he could push, seeing if anyone would intervene, but no one did. And so he kept going. Then it escalated. The racist player intensified his attack, pushing harder, going deeper, targeting not just Marcus's disability but his race, his identity, his dignity, his very humanity. He contorted his body into grotesque shapes, mimicking Marcus's movements with exaggerated cruelty that was designed to mock not just how Marcus moved, but who he was. His voice dripped with contempt and venom. He made his words sharp and cutting, designed to wound not just physically in intent, but psychologically in impact. And with each passing second, the humiliation deepened, spread wider, became more unbearable. The energy in the room shifted entirely. What had been normal seconds ago now felt toxic, dangerous, suffocating. The racist player had transformed this space into something cruel, and everyone in it became complicit by their presence and their silence. The room fell into a horrifying silence that felt worse than the mockery itself. Some people laughed uncomfortable, nervous laughter that echoed like a betrayal. The kind of laughter that comes from people who don't know how to process cruelty, so they respond with the easiest available reaction. Others looked away, unable to watch but unwilling to intervene, choosing the path of least resistance even though it meant abandoning someone who needed help. A few stood frozen, caught between shock and the terrible realization that they were witnessing something profoundly cruel, something that would stay with them, something that would reveal character in ways they hadn't anticipated. But nobody stopped him. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody defended Marcus. Nobody said a word that mattered. The silence became deafening, became a weapon in itself, became complicity dressed up as neutrality. Marcus felt it all with an intensity that's hard to describe unless you've experienced it. Every laugh felt like a blade. Every stare felt like a judgment. Every moment of abandonment from people who could have spoken up but chose silence instead felt like a collective rejection of his humanity. The disability that he had learned to navigate with grace and resilience suddenly became a punchline in someone else's joke. His race became ammunition in someone else's assault. His presence became something to mock, something to diminish, something to use as entertainment for others. He was forced to stand there in front of everyone and absorb the full weight of that cruelty with nowhere to hide, nowhere to run, nowhere to escape. There was no place that felt safe in that moment. Every face in the room represented a potential threat or a confirmed betrayal. The space that should have been neutral suddenly felt hostile, dangerous, unwelcoming. This wasn't a small moment that could be laughed off later. This wasn't a joke that simply went too far and could be forgiven with an apology. This was calculated humiliation. This was a deliberate, intentional attempt to strip another human being of their dignity in public, in front of witnesses, with an audience. This was cruelty with an audience. Cruelty performed for entertainment. Cruelty designed not just to harm but to entertain. In that moment, Marcus wasn't just being mocked, he was being erased. He was being told, in front of everyone, that he didn't matter, that his disability made him less than human, that his race made him vulnerable and fair game, that his presence was something to be ridiculed rather than respected. The message was clear, brutal, and devastating. You don't belong here. The racist player stood there, basking in what he believed was his triumph. He had gotten the reaction he wanted, some laughter, some discomfort, the attention of the room. He had dominated the space through cruelty. He had made himself feel superior by making someone else feel small and powerless, and he genuinely believed he had won. He had no idea that his victory was about to become his downfall. But something was about to change everything. Something was about to shift the entire dynamic of this moment. Because there was someone in that room who had been watching the entire thing unfold, someone who saw what was happening, someone who understood the gravity of the moment, someone who wasn't about to let this cruelty go unanswered. Marcus stood there, fighting to maintain his composure despite the storm raging inside him, fighting to keep the tears from falling despite the overwhelming urge to let them come, fighting to hold on to the dignity that had just been attacked and trampled in front of dozens of people. And in that moment of his deepest humiliation, when he felt most alone, when he felt most invisible, when he felt most like the mockery had become his entire identity, had no idea that someone in that room had been watching. He had no idea that his suffering was about to become the catalyst for something profound. Steve Harvey had been watching the entire thing unfold. He didn't miss a single moment, not the smirk that started it all, not the escalating mockery, not the way the racist player's cruelty intensified with each passing second. More importantly, he didn't miss the silence. He saw every person who looked away. He registered every uncomfortable laugh. He felt the weight of collective complicity settle over the room like a suffocating blanket. Steve Harvey was someone who understood power. He understood how to command a room, how to use his platform, how to leverage his influence. But more than that, he understood humanity. He understood what it meant to be underestimated, to be doubted, to be told that you didn't belong in spaces that were meant for you. His entire career had been built on the foundation of proving people wrong, on breaking through barriers, on refusing to accept the limitations that society tried to place on him. And watching this moment unfold, watching a disabled black man being systematically humiliated while everyone stood silent, something shifted inside him. This wasn't just about what was happening to Marcus. This was about something deeper, something more fundamental. This was about a culture that permitted cruelty. This was about systems that allowed people with power to abuse people without it. This was about the complicity of silence, about how standing still and saying nothing was actually a choice to let cruelty win. Steve Harvey had built his reputation on many things, but one of the core pillars was his ability to recognize injustice and call it out. He had spent years in entertainment, in comedy, in spaces where people tested boundaries constantly. He knew how to read a room. He knew when someone was crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. He knew the difference between humor and cruelty, between a joke and an assault. And what he was witnessing right now was unmistakably cruelty. The racist player continued his mockery, emboldened by the reactions he was getting, convinced that he had the room on his side. He had no idea that his audience was changing. He had no idea that someone in that room was reaching their breaking point. He had no idea that every additional moment of his cruelty was adding fuel to a fire that was about to consume him. Steve Harvey watched as the racist player pushed further, went deeper, made the mockery more vicious and more personal. And with each escalation, Steve's internal resolve hardened. This had to stop. This couldn't continue. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequence, this moment required intervention. But Steve Harvey wasn't going to respond in anger. He wasn't going to match the racist player's cruelty with cruelty of his own. That would be playing into the same toxic dynamic that had created this situation in the first place. No, Steve Harvey was going to do something far more devastating, was going to use his intelligence, his wit, his understanding of human nature, and his command of the room to expose the racist player for exactly what he was. He was going to dismantle him with precision. He was going to embarrass him in a way that would be impossible to come back from. The moment had to be perfect. The timing had to be flawless. Because what Steve Harvey was about to do wasn't just about defending Marcus, it was about sending a message to everyone in that room. It was about demonstrating that cruelty has consequences. It was about showing that silence is a choice, and that choice has a price. Steve Harvey watched and waited. He let the racist player continue his performance, let him dig deeper into the hole he was creating for himself, let him believe that he was winning. Because the deeper he went, the more indefensible his actions became. The more he escalated, the more obvious his cruelty became. And when the moment was right, when the racist player had fully committed to his mockery, when his guard was completely down, when he was absolutely convinced of his victory, that's when Steve Harvey would strike. The room didn't know it yet, but it was about to witness a masterclass in how to respond to injustice. It was about to see someone with genuine power use that power not to dominate but to protect. It was about to watch as arrogance met its reckoning. Marcus was still standing there, still absorbing the blows, still fighting to maintain his dignity. He had no idea that relief was coming. He had no idea that someone had seen him, truly seen him, and decided that enough was enough. He had no idea that in the next moment, his entire experience of this situation was about to transform. Steve Harvey took a breath. He measured the room. He waited for the racist player to land one final decisive blow, one last moment of mockery that would be so egregious, so obvious, so undeniable in its cruelty that there would be no way to defend it. And then, when that moment came, Steve Harvey was going to respond in a way that would change everything. The racist player was reaching the crescendo of his performance. He was confident, he was emboldened, he was absolutely certain that he had won. He had no idea that he was walking toward his own destruction, that his cruelty was about to become the very thing that would expose him, that his moment of triumph was about to become his moment of reckoning. And Steve Harvey was ready. The moment arrived with the precision of a perfectly timed punchline. The racist player had just delivered what he believed was his knockout blow, a final, exaggerated mockery that drew laughter from the crowd, that made him feel invincible, that convinced him he had completely dominated the room. He stood there, basking in what he thought was his victory, his chest puffed out with arrogance, his face flushed with the intoxication of power. His eyes were gleaming with the kind of satisfaction that comes from believing you've successfully humiliated someone and gotten away with it. He was riding high on the adrenaline of cruelty, intoxicated by the laughter of the crowd, convinced beyond any shadow of a doubt that he had achieved exactly what he set out to do. That is when Steve Harvey stood up. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, purposeful. It wasn't aggressive or theatrical, it was something far more powerful. It was calm, it was controlled. It was the kind of movement that commands attention not through volume but through presence, not through noise, but through the unmistakable gravity of someone who is about to say something that matters. The air in the room seemed to shift with his motion. The casual ease that had characterized the moments before suddenly evaporated, replaced by an electric tension that made everyone sit up straighter, that made everyone pay closer attention, that made everyone understand on an intuitive level that something significant was about to happen. The room felt the shift immediately. The laughter died mid-breath. The casual conversations that had been happening on the periphery stopped abruptly. The energy changed from chaotic and dispersed to focused and concentrated. Everyone's attention pivoted toward Steve Harvey, and in that single moment the entire dynamic of the room transformed from a celebration of cruelty to a courtroom where judgment was about to be rendered. The racist player's smile faltered, first a subtle dropping of the corners of his mouth that was barely perceptible but unmistakably present. For the first time since his performance had begun, uncertainty flickered across his face. He had been so confident, so assured, so absolutely certain that he had the room on his side. But something in Steve Harvey's demeanor, something in the way he carried himself, something in the unmistakable message being broadcast by his body language, told the racist player that his moment of triumph had ended, and something far more dangerous was beginning. His eyes found Steve Harvey's, searching desperately for understanding, searching for reassurance that everything was still going according to his plan, searching for some indication that this was just another person who would eventually laugh along or look away. But what he saw in Steve Harvey's expression told him everything he needed to know with crystal clarity. His plan had just fallen apart completely. His moment of victory had transformed into something else entirely, and he was about to discover what it felt like to be on the receiving end of genuine confrontation. Steve Harvey moved forward slowly, deliberately, with the kind of measured pace that builds tension with every single step. He wasn't rushing toward conflict. He wasn't charging with anger or aggression. Instead, he moved with the confident, unhurried stride of someone who knows exactly what they're doing, who has complete command of the situation, who understands that speed is not necessary when certainty is absolute. Each step brought him closer to the racist player, and with each step the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The anticipation became almost unbearable. Everyone understood that they were about to witness something transformative. When Steve Harvey spoke, his voice was calm but carried an edge that cut through the room like a blade, forged specifically for this moment. He didn't begin with anger or accusation or moral outrage. Instead, he started with observation, clinical, precise, devastatingly accurate observation about exactly what had just happened and exactly what it revealed about the person who had perpetrated it. His words were chosen with the care of a surgeon selecting instruments for a delicate procedure. "You know what I just watched?" Steve Harvey said, his eyes locked on the racist player with an intensity that seemed almost physical in its force. The question wasn't really a question in the traditional sense. It was the beginning of an execution, delivered with surgical precision, structured like a rhetorical device designed to make the racist player understand before Steve Harvey even provided the answer. "I watched someone who is so insecure, so deeply threatened by his own inadequacy, so fundamentally afraid of his own insignificance, that the only way he could manufacture a feeling of power was to tear down someone else, someone who couldn't defend himself with a disability, someone whose race he could attack because he knew society had given him permission to do so. That's not strength. That's not humor. That's not wit or intelligence or cleverness. That's the behavior of someone who is desperately, pathetically afraid of his own insignificance, so terrified of being discovered as ordinary that he needs to diminish other people just to feel like he exists at all." The racist player tried to respond, tried to deflect with humor, tried to minimize what had happened by framing it as just a joke that went too far, tried to turn it into something acceptable by suggesting that everyone was overreacting. But Steve Harvey didn't allow it. He continued speaking with the unstoppable momentum of someone whose logic was unassailable and whose moral authority in that moment was absolute. "You mocked someone for a disability they didn't choose. You didn't wake up one day and decide that you wanted to navigate the world in a wheelchair or with physical limitations. That wasn't a choice. But you attacked him for it anyway because you saw it as weakness, because you believed that disability made him less than human, because you thought it was acceptable to use someone's physical reality as the punchline to your joke. That's not humor, that's dehumanization. And then you attack someone for their racism, something that is fundamental to their identity, something that connects them to generations of resilience and strength and survival against impossible odds. Something that you clearly don't understand and have never bothered to try to understand. You did it in front of all these people because you thought it would make you look big, thought it would make you seem powerful, thought it would elevate you in the eyes of everyone watching." Steve Harvey's voice grew more intense, not louder but more concentrated, more focused, more deadly in its precision. "But do you know what it actually made you look like? Do you have any idea what everyone in this room actually saw when they looked at you?" The racist player's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, unable to produce sound, unable to formulate a response, unable to defend himself against the truth that was bearing down on him. "It made you look like exactly what you are, you coward. A small, frightened man who needs to diminish others just to feel like he exists. A person so hollow inside that he has to fill the void with cruelty, has to feed his ego with someone else's humiliation, has to create victims just to feel like a victor. And the worst part? The worst part is that you were so convinced of your own superiority, so absolutely certain that you had everyone on your side, so delusional about your own significance that you didn't even realize how transparent your insecurity is, how obvious it is to anyone paying attention, to anyone with even a modicum of emotional intelligence, to anyone who understands human nature, that you are fundamentally broken in some deep way, and no amount of mockery, no amount of cruelty, no amount of humiliation directed toward other people is ever going to fix what is broken inside you. No amount of laughter from a crowd is ever going to fill the emptiness you feel. No amount of momentary triumph is ever going to heal the fundamental inadequacy that drives you to do things like this. The racist player's face went through a series of transformations that played out like a tragedy in real time. First came anger, a flash of defensive rage as he tried to maintain his bravado and pretend that none of this was affecting him. Then came denial, an attempt to convince himself and everyone else that Steve Harvey was wrong, that his actions weren't as bad as they were being portrayed, that he was being victimized by an overreaction. Then came the first crack in his armor, a moment where shame began to seep through despite his attempts to suppress it. And finally came desperation, a desperate grasping at any lifeline, any excuse, any justification that might pull him out of the quicksand he found himself sinking into. He tried to defend himself, but his words came out weak, ineffective, pathetic. He tried to explain that he was just joking, that everyone was being too sensitive, that it was all in good fun, but each excuse fell flat in the face of Steve Harvey's unwavering logic, in the face of the reality of what had actually happened, in the face of the undeniable truth that his actions had been cruel and deliberate and designed specifically to humiliate another human being. That's the thing about bullies, Steve Harvey continued, not giving the racist player a moment to recover, not allowing him space to regroup or reorganize his defense. They always tell themselves stories, they always have justifications, they always convince themselves that what they were doing is acceptable, that they were just having fun, that everyone else is overreacting, that the person they were attacking is somehow deserving of it. But those stories are lies. And deep down, you know they were lies. You know exactly what you were doing. You knew it was cruel. You knew it was designed to hurt. You knew that the person you were attacking couldn't fight back. And you did it anyway because that's what cowards do. They attack people who can defend themselves. Steve Harvey turned to face the room, and now his voice carried a different quality, not anger anymore, but profound disappointment mixed with a kind of moral authority that seemed to fill the entire space. "And the rest of you," he said, addressing the silent witnesses with the directness of someone who was holding up a mirror and forcing everyone to look at their own reflection. "I saw you. I saw every single person who laughed. I saw every person who looked away. I saw every person who stood silent and let this happen. I saw the choice that each of you made in real time. That silence is a choice. That laughter is a choice. That looking away is a choice. And those choices say something fundamental about who you are as people. Those choices reveal something essential about your character. Those choices demonstrate whether you are the kind of person who will stand up for what's right, or whether you are the kind of person who will go along with cruelty as long as it doesn't directly affect you." The weight of his words settled over the room like a judgment that was inescapable. People began to look at each other with newfound awareness of their own complicity, with a sudden understanding that they had been participants in something they would have to live with the uncomfortable recognition that they had made choices that mattered. The comfort of the crowd had been shattered. The anonymity that had allowed them to participate in cruelty had been stripped away. Every person in that room suddenly understood that they had been seen, that their actions had been noted, that they were now implicated in what had happened. Steve Harvey turned back to the racist player, and now his voice carried a finality that was absolute and inescapable, the kind of finality that comes from someone who has made a definitive judgment and has no doubt whatsoever about its accuracy. "You came into this room thinking you were going to prove something about yourself. You were going to show how clever you are, how funny you are, how superior you are, how much better you are than the people around you. You were going to cement your status as someone who gets to decide what's acceptable, someone who gets to set the rules, someone who has the power to make other people feel small. But what you've actually proven is that you are a bully. You are a coward. You are someone so fundamentally insecure, so desperately afraid of your own inadequacy that you need to attack a disabled man, that you need to weaponize someone's race, that you need to systematically humiliate another human being just to feel like you matter. And now everyone in this room knows it. Everyone will remember this moment. Everyone will carry this memory forward. And every single person here will remember that you are the person who did this. You are the person who thought it was acceptable to mock someone's disability. You are the person who thought it was funny to attack someone's race. You are the person who stood in front of all these witnesses and revealed your true nature. That is your legacy now. That is what people will think of when they think of you. The racist player stood there, completely exposed, completely diminished, completely destroyed, not through physical confrontation, but through the simple act of being truly seen and accurately described. His armor of arrogance had been stripped away layer by layer until nothing remained but the raw reality of who he actually was. His cruelty had been reflected back at him in a way that made it impossible to deny, impossible to defend, impossible to escape from or reframe or justify in any way that made sense. The room had transformed. What had been his domain, his stage, his platform had become his courtroom, and the verdict was clear and irreversible. Steve Harvey then turned to Marcus, a deliberate, powerful gesture that shifted all the energy in the room, that redirected all the attention, that fundamentally altered the narrative from one of cruelty to one of validation. It was a gesture that said, "This is who matters in this moment. This is the person whose dignity matters. This is the person who deserves your respect and your attention." "And you," Steve Harvey said to Marcus, his voice softening but losing none of its power, his tone shifting from judgment to affirmation. "You showed more strength in your silence than this man showed in his entire performance. You showed more dignity in your restraint than he showed in his whole life. You maintained your composure. You refused to be diminished. You didn't fight back with cruelty or match his attacks with your own. You simply stood there and maintained your humanity, maintained your integrity, maintained your sense of self despite everything being thrown at you. That is real power. That is real strength. That is what genuine confidence looks like. That is what a human being looks like when they are truly secure in who they are, not someone who needs to tear others down, but someone who can absorb cruelty and refuse to let it define them." The silence that followed Steve Harvey's words was unlike any silence that had come before. This wasn't the silence of complicity or the silence of avoidance. This was the silence of reckoning, the silence of people processing what they had just witnessed, the silence of a room that had been fundamentally transformed by what had transpired. Marcus stood there, breathing deeply, allowing the weight of what had just happened to settle over him. For the first time since the mockery had begun, he didn't feel alone. He didn't feel abandoned. He didn't feel like the entire room had turned against him. Instead, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel in that moment. He felt seen. He felt validated. He felt like his humanity had been acknowledged by someone with genuine authority, someone with a platform, someone whose words carried weight and consequence. The racist player tried to maintain some semblance of dignity, tried to construct some final defense, tried to recover some shred of his former confidence. But it was too late. He had been exposed completely, utterly, irreversibly. His cruelty had been called out with such precision, such accuracy, such undeniable logic, that there was no recovering from it. He was done. He was finished. His reputation in that room had been destroyed not through retribution, but through the simple act of being accurately described, of having his true nature revealed for everyone to see. What Steve Harvey had accomplished in those few minutes went far beyond simply defending Marcus. He had fundamentally altered the power dynamic in that room. He had demonstrated that cruelty has a price, that arrogance leads to exposure, that there are consequences for treating another human being with contempt and disrespect. More than that, he had shown everyone watching that standing up for what's right doesn't require matching someone's cruelty with cruelty of your own. It doesn't require violence or aggression or losing control. It requires clarity. It requires moral authority. It requires the ability to articulate truth in a way that is so undeniable that it cannot be refuted, or minimized, or explained away. People began to move differently in the room. The casual comfort that had characterized the moments before had evaporated completely. Some people approached Marcus tentatively at first, uncertain, but gradually with more confidence to apologize, to acknowledge what had happened, to attempt some form of reconciliation for their complicity in the silence. Others simply left, unable to process what had happened, unable to face their own role in what had transpired. A few stood frozen, still processing, still coming to terms with the fact that they had been implicated in cruelty simply by standing by and doing nothing. The racist player attempted to salvage what remained of his dignity by making a hasty exit, by removing himself from the room before the full weight of his humiliation could crush him completely. But there was no dignity in his departure. There was only the transparent escape of someone who had been defeated, who had been exposed, who understood that his presence in that space had become intolerable. His exit was less a departure and more a retreat, the movement of someone who had lost a battle so completely that staying would only deepen the wound. Steve Harvey didn't watch him leave. Instead, he remained focused on Marcus, making sure that the final image, the final message, the final narrative that would stick in everyone's mind was one of validation rather than cruelty. He placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture that was both personal and public, that acknowledged Marcus's humanity, while simultaneously broadcasting to everyone in the room that this was a person worthy of respect and solidarity. "Thank you for being here," Steve Harvey said to Marcus, his voice quieter now but still carrying the same weight of authenticity that had characterized everything he had said. "Thank you for not letting what happened define you. Thank you for showing everyone in this room what real strength looks like." Marcus felt tears finally beginning to fall, not tears of shame or humiliation anymore, but tears of relief, tears of vindication, tears that represented the emotional release that comes from being truly seen and truly supported by someone with genuine power. He had come into that day expecting to simply exist, to navigate the space as he had learned to navigate, the world with quiet dignity and without complaint. He hadn't expected to be humiliated. He hadn't expected his disability and his race to become weapons that would be used against him. And he definitely hadn't expected someone like Steve Harvey to stand up and fight for his dignity in such a comprehensive, articulate, and definitive way. The room had become a different place. What had been a space of cruelty and complicity had become a space of moral clarity and accountability. The narrative had been completely inverted. The person who had entered as a victor had exited as a defeated man. The person who had been targeted for humiliation had been lifted up and validated, and everyone who had stood silent had been forced to confront their own complicity and their own choices. Steve Harvey's intervention had ripples that extended far beyond the immediate moment. People who had laughed and looked away began to reflect on why they had made those choices. People who had stood silent began to question their own courage and their own moral foundations. People who had assumed they would never be called out for their complicity suddenly understood that there could be consequences, that standing by passively wasn't actually a neutral position, but a choice with meaning and weight. More importantly, Steve Harvey had demonstrated something essential about power and how it could be used. He had shown that genuine power doesn't come from dominating others or from making people feel small. It comes from moral clarity, from the courage to stand up for what's right, from the ability to articulate truth in a way that is undeniable. He had shown that the most devastating way to confront cruelty isn't through matching it with cruelty of your own, but through exposing it completely, through describing it accurately, through forcing the person who perpetrated it to see themselves as they truly are. Marcus began to understand in that moment something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He understood that his disability didn't make him weak or unworthy of respect. He understood that his race was not a liability, but a fundamental part of his identity that was worthy of pride and celebration. He understood that the cruelty he had experienced didn't diminish his humanity. Instead, it had given him an opportunity to witness someone with genuine authority stand up and affirm that humanity in front of witnesses. The day that had begun with humiliation had transformed into something entirely different. It had become a moment of redemption, a moment of clarity, a moment that would define not just Marcus's understanding of himself, but everyone's understanding of what it means to stand up for what's right and what it costs to perpetrate cruelty. Steve Harvey's words would echo through that room for a long time. People would remember not just what he said, but how he said it, the precision with which he articulated the truth, the clarity with which he exposed the racist player's insecurity and cruelty. His intervention would become a reference point, a moment people pointed to when they talked about standing up for what's right, about using power responsibly, about confronting injustice directly and unambiguously. And Marcus would carry with him, for the rest of his life, the knowledge that there was someone out there who saw him, who understood his dignity, who was willing to stand up and fight for his right to be treated with respect and humanity. That knowledge would sustain him through difficult moments. That knowledge would remind him that his worth wasn't dependent on anyone else's validation. But that validation, when it came, could be powerful and transformative and redemptive. The racist player would also carry something with him for the rest of his life, memory of being exposed completely, of having his cruelty articulated so clearly that there was no way to deny it or minimize it or frame it differently. He would understand, in a way he perhaps hadn't before, that there were consequences for cruelty, that arrogance leads to humiliation, that the world had limits beyond which behavior became indefensible. The moment Steve Harvey walked away from that confrontation, something shifted in the broader consciousness of everyone who had witnessed it. What had happened in that room didn't stay contained within those four walls. It began to spread through conversations, through social media, through the natural human tendency to process significant events, by talking about them, by sharing them, by making sense of them with other people. People who had been in the room started recounting the story to friends and family members who hadn't been there. They described the way Steve Harvey had stood up, the precision of his words, the absolute destruction of the racist player's arrogance. They talked about how he hadn't needed to raise his voice or resort to physical confrontation. They marveled at how completely and utterly the power dynamic had been inverted through nothing but clarity, truth-telling, and moral authority. The story began to take on a life of its own. Different versions circulated, each one highlighting different aspects of what had happened. Some people focused on Steve Harvey's brilliant takedown, on his ability to articulate what had been wrong with the racist player's behavior in such devastating terms. Others focused on Marcus's quiet dignity, on the way he had maintained his composure and refused to be diminished by the cruelty directed at him. Still others focused on the moment of reckoning that everyone in the room had experienced, the uncomfortable confrontation with their own complicity and their own choices about whether to stand up or stand silent. The racist player, meanwhile, was experiencing the consequences of his actions in ways he hadn't anticipated. People who had found him acceptable before, people who had been willing to laugh along, who had enjoyed his company, who had seen him as entertaining or clever, began to distance themselves from him. They didn't want to be associated with someone who had been so thoroughly exposed as a bully and a coward. They didn't want to risk being implicated in his cruelty by continuing to spend time with him or defend him. His social circle began to contract. Invitations that had previously come his way stopped arriving. People who had previously sought out his company now avoided him. The status he had enjoyed, the sense of being someone important or clever or entertaining, had been completely stripped away. He found himself isolated in a way that went far beyond simple social ostracism. He was being rejected not because of some minor social transgression, but because his true nature had been revealed so completely that people couldn't continue pretending they hadn't seen what they had seen. For some people, this isolation might have served as an opportunity for genuine reflection and change. It might have prompted them to examine their behavior, to understand why they felt the need to mock and humiliate others, to begin the difficult work of transforming themselves into someone capable of genuine empathy and respect. But for the racist player, the initial response was different. The initial response was defensive anger, resentment that he had been singled out, bitterness that Steve Harvey had made him a target, frustration that his moment of triumph had been stolen from him. Over time, however, something began to shift. The isolation that he experienced, the repeated rejection from people he had thought of as friends, the constant awareness that his reputation had been fundamentally destroyed, all of this began to wear on him. He began to understand, in a way that perhaps he hadn't before, what it felt like to be on the receiving end of social rejection, what it felt like to be excluded and dismissed, what it felt like to be treated as less than human because of something fundamental about who you were. This understanding, born from his own experience of suffering the consequences of his actions, began to create a possibility, not a guarantee, but a possibility that he might eventually move toward genuine transformation, not because he suddenly became a good person, but because he had experienced directly the pain that his cruelty inflicted. Meanwhile, Marcus was experiencing a very different kind of ripple effect. People who had previously ignored him or been indifferent to his presence began to approach him with respect and solidarity. The moment of humiliation that he had endured had transformed into a moment of vindication, not because anything about him had changed, but because Steve Harvey had been willing to publicly affirm his dignity and worth. Marcus found himself receiving invitations to speak about his experience, to share his story, to become a voice for others who had experienced similar forms of mockery and humiliation. The disability community reached out to express solidarity and to acknowledge the courage it took to maintain dignity in the face of such targeted cruelty. Members of the Black community similarly reached out, recognizing in Marcus's experience something that echoed their own experiences of having their identity weaponized against them. What had begun as a moment of humiliation transformed into a platform. What had been intended as an attack became, through Steve Harvey's intervention and the broader community response, a moment of empowerment. Marcus's story, became a story that mattered, that resonated with people, that had the potential to inspire others who had experienced similar treatment to stand up for themselves and refuse to be diminished by cruelty. The broader cultural conversation shifted as well. What had happened in that room became a case study in how to confront bullying, how to stand up against injustice, how to use power responsibly and ethically. People cited Steve Harvey's intervention as an example of what it looked like to do the right thing, to put your platform and your reputation on the line for the sake of defending someone who couldn't defend themselves. Schools began to use the story as a teaching tool, showing it to students as an example of how bullying works, how bystanders can either enable cruelty through their silence or interrupt it through their intervention. Communities used it as a jumping-off point for conversations about accountability, about complicity, about what it means to stand up for what's right even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. The racist player's name, meanwhile, became synonymous with cruelty and cowardice, not because Steve Harvey had made personal attacks against him, but because his own actions, when held up to scrutiny, had revealed him to be exactly those things. His humiliation became a kind of cautionary Talia story that people told to illustrate what happens when you cross certain lines, when you decide that cruelty is acceptable, when you believe that targeting someone's disability or race is a legitimate form of entertainment. Years later, people would still remember that moment. They would still talk about, they would still cite it as a pivotal moment in their understanding of what courage looks like, what responsibility looks like, what it means to stand up for someone who has been targeted for mockery and humiliation. Steve Harvey didn't become famous because of this moment. He was already famous. But his reputation was deepened and solidified by it. People understood him not just as an entertainer or a businessman, but as someone who had genuine moral conviction, someone who was willing to use his platform to stand up for what was right, someone who understood that power carried responsibility, and that responsibility sometimes meant putting yourself in an uncomfortable position to defend someone else's dignity. And Marcus became something he might never have expected to become: a symbol, an inspiration, a reminder that maintaining dignity in the face of cruelty is possible, that being targeted doesn't have to define you, that there are people in the world who will stand up and fight for your right to be treated with respect and humanity. The ripple effect extended in all directions, touching lives in ways that none of the people involved could have fully anticipated. A moment of cruelty had been transformed into a moment of clarity and moral reckoning, a moment that would continue to resonate and inspire for years to come.